All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our Maritime Town Hall. I'm Cliff Neve, Vice President of Maritime Cyber for Med Security. I'm a retired Coast Guard commander with over 30 years experience in maritime and the IT and cybersecurity. So this is my personal passion. Today we're going to talk about something that almost every maritime organization struggles with, and that's translating cybersecurity policy into operational practice. Most organizations already know that cybersecurity is important. Many have policies and procedures in place, but when it comes to actually implement these controls in environments where uptime, safety, and cargo flow are critical, things can get complicated in a hurry. So what I want to do today is walk through a practical way to operationalize cyber risk management without disrupting operations. Most maritime organizations understand cyber at a high level, but execution is where things fall down. So ports, terminals, and maritime facilities operate in environments where downtime simply isn't acceptable. You can't just take systems offline because a patch is available or a security tool needs to be installed or updated. On top of that, cybersecurity teams often have limited visibility in operational technology environments, and responsibility for cyber risk isn't always clearly defined. We'll talk about that later too. So what ends up happening is organizations have cybersecurity policies that look great on paper, but don't translate into operational reality. And that's one of the things we're going to try to solve today. Cybersecurity initiatives also often stall because they collide with operational priorities. For example, cybersecurity teams want to patch systems, but operations worry about downtime. Network segmentation might improve security, but operations may worry it will break existing workflows. Even something as basic as asset inventory can be difficult in an operational environment with legacy equipment. And we all know that a lot of the fleet has legacy equipment, which is difficult to upgrade and patch. When those conflicts occur, safety and uptime will always win. And honestly, they should. So the real question becomes, how do we align cybersecurity with the operational realities? We need to comport with them, not vice versa. One of the reasons maritime cybersecurity is challenging is the complexity of the environment. Ports and maritime facilities combine traditional IT systems with industrial control systems, terminal equipment, vessel connections, and logistics platforms. These systems are often interconnected in ways that weren't originally designed with cybersecurity in mind. Back to those legacy systems. That means that cyber risk isn't just an IT problem. It's an operational risk that can directly impact safety, cargo movement, and business continuity. And those are the three things the Coast Guard is focusing on with their cyber rule in the maritime transportation system. We're also seeing increasing regulatory attention on maritime cyber. As I mentioned, the Coast Guard is shifting towards operational accountability. And they're expecting organizations to conduct their own cyber risk assessments, develop their own cybersecurity plans, define roles and responsibilities within their organizations for who's doing what, and to coordinate incident response when incidents happen. Reporting is also a key element of incident response and one the Coast Guard definitely foot stomps. So the key point here is that regulators are increasingly looking for evidence that cybersecurity is operationalized, not just documented. In other words, cybersecurity has to be something that the organization actually does, not just something that exists in a policy binder someplace on somebody's shelf. One of the most common questions I hear from maritime organizations is, where do we begin? So many organizations have limited cybersecurity resources. I've never heard an organization say that they're perfectly good with the cyber resources they have. They also have limited OT experience and expertise in most cases. It's a very complicated field, and each operational technology device may have its own different characteristics, and vendors, there's a variety of vendors that do things differently. And there are also operational and competing priorities. So there's also uncertainty about regulatory expectations because there are so many standards to choose from. Because of that, cybersecurity efforts often stall before they really begin. Folks get a little bit of analysis paralysis. The answer is not to create more policy, it's to align cybersecurity with operations. What I want to introduce today is a practical framework that organizations can implement in about 60 to 90 days as far as the strategy goes. The process is fairly straightforward. First, you have to understand your operational environment. Second, identify cyber risks that might impact those operations that the operational environment is working in. Third, assign responsibility for managing those risks. And we already know that the CISO is going to be the stuckey for all things from the Coast Guard's perspective, but the CISO is not acting alone. So we're going to go a little bit in more detail about responsibility. Fourth, integrate cybersecurity into operational workflows. And finally, establish monitoring and response capabilities, because you can defend things as much as you want, but a determined adversary that's well-resourced is going to get in if they want, and users are going to do silly things. And so you have to patrol your network with monitoring and response. So our goal is to focus on risk reduction rather than compliance framework and paperwork. The first step, as I mentioned, is understanding what systems actually support operations. This includes things like terminal operating systems, crane control system, fuel management systems, access control, and vessel connectivity platforms. In many cases, these are managed by different teams within the organization and documented in different places. Mapping them requires and provides a baseline understanding of how operations actually function. So this is kind of taking an inventory of what's going on. This also requires operators' input to determine where those systems are, where the blind spots may be. Because if just the IT shop does this, they're going to miss things, especially in a complicated environment, complicated terminal system where they just don't have visibility in a lot of these operational technology systems. So without this understanding, it's very difficult to manage cyber risk effectively. And if you haven't done this, you have to. In order to go to the next step, you have to understand what's on your network. There's a reason that the CIS 18, the first two controls of that are what's on your network from a network perspective and what software do you have. And if you don't have those two, stop, because implementing controls aren't going to be useful on systems that you're not aware exist. So you have to have this in place before you start anything else. And once you understand the operational environment, you have all your systems mapped, and you understand the operational impact, the next step is identifying risks that could impact those operations. Instead of focusing on theoretical vulnerabilities, focus on operational impact. Ask questions like, what systems could stop cargo movement? Which systems impact safety? What systems connect to external networks or have third parties that are somehow accessing them? Then what you do is you prioritize your risks based on operational impact, likelihood, and how easy they are to mitigate. Sometimes, it makes sense when you're looking at your risks. If something is simple, even though it's not a high risk and you can implement it immediately, there's no reason not to do so and spend time reshuffling and recategorizing things. So sometimes ease of mitigation is a factor, and take care of the low-hanging fruit as well as the very highest risk priorities, and that'll put you in a good situation. Cybersecurity often fails when responsibility is unclear. And I've said this before, and I'll keep reiterating it. Maybe the most important thing that came out of the Coast Guard's cyber rule is the designation of a CISO. Because before, you would go to ports and you'd say, who's responsible for cybersecurity? And you'd get, well, it's maybe the FSO, kind of. The IT group is sort of responsible for it. We have a safety team, they're sort of responsible for it. And that resulted in a zone defense where a lot of things were being missed. Nobody had accountability. And so the Coast Guard's made it clear that they expect the CISO to be designated in writing, and that individual is ultimately responsible. That doesn't mean that they do everything or have all the answers. And in complex organizations, they're just flat not. They're going to have to rely on their FSO, their IT teams, their operation teams to not only understand the baseline for what things are, but also to collect information on what's changing, because these operations and networks aren't static, and the threats aren't static. We're in a very elevated situation right now from a threat perspective, where everyone as a team needs to be on the same page and communicating as far as the different threat actors that may be exercising different tactics, techniques, and procedures given the situation. So IT teams clearly have responsibilities, but operations teams, that's where I'm foot stomping. They have to be involved. They play a pivotal role because they control many of the systems that are involved. And in many cases, what I see at these terminals is the operations teams are operating independently and they are coordinating upgrades or updates to systems that the CISO may or may not be privy to. So cybersecurity becomes much more effective when responsibility is shared and communicated well, rather than just one person being responsible for going and finding out from these different people. Everyone has to keep this front of mind and understand that if they're doing something, oh yeah, there is an implication from a cybersecurity perspective. I do need to let the CISO know. So you have to be a relentless collaborator as a CISO. Instead of creating entirely new processes, cybersecurity should be embedded in existing operational workflows. Nothing is going to make the operators upset quite like saying, we in IT or we as the CISO, we in cybersecurity have figured out the way that you need to do things in operations. That's not going to go well. And so, for example, maintenance windows can include cybersecurity updates. If you work closely with the operators and you understand, hey, the ship's going to be down from this time to this time, those are good windows of opportunity to perform your updates, your upgrades, to do testing and things like that that aren't going to impact operations. Equipment upgrades can include cybersecurity reviews as well. While you're upgrading the equipment, check, make sure you have the latest versions. Check to make sure that physical security is in place. Physical and cyber are inextricably linked. Vendor onboarding can also include cybersecurity requirements, and they should. When you have a vendor, especially if they're doing IT or OT systems, there should be contractual language around when and how they do updates and upgrades, whether they do so remotely, whether they do so on site, and what that process is. And your cybersecurity plan should include those third-party or vendor rules of engagement and how those are done to make sure to vet the vendor properly, and make sure that those connections are secure and that the right people are actually making the updates and upgrades to the systems. Incident response reporting processes can also include cyber indicators. And when cybersecurity becomes part of how operations already function, it becomes a lot easier to sustain. Detection and response capabilities are critical, as I've mentioned. You can't stop a determined adversary who's well-resourced from getting into your environment. They're going to figure out a way in. Organizations should ensure that they have visibility into both their IT and operational networks. This includes what I call patrolling, threat hunting. If you know that there is an existing threat that's out there, if you subscribe to some of the threat hunting or some of the threat feeds, you should implement and integrate those new threats into your assessments. So you should have incident response procedures that involve both cyber teams and operational leadership, and they should understand reporting requirements if an incident occurs. And the Coast Guard requires, they have thresholds for when requirements are for reporting are, and those need to be well understood. There should be a playbook, effectively, as we call them in cybersecurity operations. A playbook of if-then statements. If this happens, who do I call? Who am I responsible for calling? And cybersecurity maturity improves over time through monitoring, response, and continuous improvement. What we've seen is that some of the nation states have had dwell times of up to 4 years. Volt Typhoon was a situation where dwell times were years, plural. And what that indicates to me is that proper monitoring wasn't being done. Logs weren't being reviewed. And so having some type of security operations capability is pivotal to stopping those advanced persistent threats and finding them. Log reviews shouldn't be reactive. They should be proactive. So coordination between cyber and operational teams is critical. And this is where tabletop exercises also increase camaraderie. And I will make a huge foot stomp here for that. when you have your tabletop exercises and you're talking through scenarios, hey, we've been hit with ransomware. Do we pay the ransom? Well, that answer doesn't come from the IT team or the OT team or the CISO. The operators, the business leadership of an organization is going to make that determination. And so walking them through those if-then statements, who is authorized to make the case on how you treat a ransomware actor? Do you have some type of IR retainer in place with somebody to negotiate with a ransomware actor? All those kinds of things come to light. And what I found is that tabletop exercises around response really build camaraderie and increase communications amongst teams and result in the integration of the organization and being able to respond in a bad day. Operational teams often resist cybersecurity initiatives because they believe those initiatives will slow operations. One of the most effective ways to reduce that resistance is involving them early in the process and also helping them to understand the why. Most operators these days do understand that cybersecurity is a risk. They understand the implications, but they appreciate it to varying degrees. And so including them in the why and part of the training, the reason that the training is a requirement is so that the entire organization understands what the impacts could be. So if we frame cybersecurity as the operational risk that it is, not just a technical risk, then we can win this battle. Prioritize practical controls that support resilience. Implement controls that are reasonable and realistic. As a CISO/CISO, you should be finding the correct path to yes for your operators, not just shutting them down and saying, no, you can't do that because it doesn't meet this or that control. You need to be creative in finding compensating controls and being reasonable in how you're implementing those controls so that you're a good partner to them and making the business flow. When cybersecurity is seen as supporting operations rather than interfering with them, adoption is going to improve significantly. To summarize, cybersecurity must be operational. For too long, it's been an IT problem. And my good friend, Dr. Gary Kessler, once said, the way to solve cybersecurity challenge is to take the computer scientists out. And so he had something there. It must be operational, not theoretical. These things are happening and must be well understood. So successful organizations align cybersecurity with port operations. They clearly define responsibility for cyber risk. We see normally RACI charts with responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So who actually has those actions in a bad day is going to be critical. They prioritize risks that affect safety and cargo movement, and they integrate cybersecurity into operational workflows. When organizations take that approach, cybersecurity becomes sustainable. After this session, there's several practical steps you can take. You can start with your operational cyber risk assessment. Figure out what systems whose degradation of confidentiality, integrity, or availability might result in a transportation security incident. Make sure to have a complete list. Leave no stone unturned, involve other stakeholders. The next step is identifying those critical operational systems and prioritizing them. Then define responsibilities across your teams and develop a 90-day implementation plan to start with how you're going to implement controls that are going to enable operations and make your operations more secure. These steps can move an organization from policy to operational security. Thank you for joining today's town hall. I hope this provided a practical perspective on implementing cybersecurity in maritime environments. If you have any questions or would like to continue the conversation, I'd be happy to connect. Any questions? Okay, yep, there is one question.